Hey people, so the other day, in the comments of my Sonaris Pattern Destroyer breakdown, I was asked about Covenant design patterns. This is something I've always wanted to do a video about since I personally refer to all the larger warships by their Covenant names, but I know most people use their 3-letter human designations. Thought I'd take some time to talk about the design pattern system and briefly go over all the names for the canon ship patterns. This video ended up being an overview of the entire Covenant Navy, but never fear, I'll go over most of these ships and their human counterparts in depth at a later date in their own specific breakdowns. I've got my work cut out for me. So, Covenant ships, as I said in that video, aren't built the same way human ones are. The term grown is often used to describe the process, and it makes sense. On High Charity and a few Covenant planets, there are these things called assembly forges. These are large manufacturing facilities that use nanomachines to create various items, from armor to small arms to ship components. The nanomachines piece these things together molecule by molecule, giving the impression of something growing like a plant or fungus. These are a very imperfect imitation of the Forerunner assembly vats that serve the same function. The machines are operated by these elites, the Sangheli artisans, who hold one of the very few non-combat positions for a Sangheli that are actually respected. The Jiralhane traditionally prefer to create things in their clan workshops, with the exception of the Banished, who we've seen them use assembly forges a few times, mostly on the Ark. Anyway, the assembly forges all use the same manufacturing methods to create anything the Covenant uses. A design pattern is created by the artisans with the blessing of the prophets, and input into an assembly forge, like a 3D printer. They do come in varying sizes, with the primary assembly forges being the largest. The majority of those would have been destroyed alongside High Charity, so many of the larger ships that we see the Covenant use can no longer really be built, at least not in the same quantity. There may be a few primary assembly forges out there somewhere, but as for the assault carriers and definitely the super carriers, we may never see them manufactured ever again, unless artisans kept records of them. The secondary forges are still around though to forge light cruisers and corvettes. The tertiary assembly forges created all the land, air, and sea vehicles, from scarabs to ghosts, as well as the guns and armor harnesses that the ground forces wear. Here we see a tertiary assembly forge creating a Deuteros pattern scarab. The Mirren pattern support ship actually has tertiary assembly forges on it, manufacturing food packs, maintenance kits, clothing, and small arms. If they ever overproduced anything, it was typical practice to ship excess material back to High Charity for redistribution. It's likely that refit stations like the Unyielding Hierophant also had some sort of assembly forges on board. We know of one active planet-based assembly forge, the Kolar Manufactorum. It's located in the state of Vadam on Sanghelios. As you could probably guess, that is the state that good old Thel is the Kaidan of. This forge is responsible for some of the things like the Mikpramu pattern Phantom and the Helioscrill class Mjolnir. I think we can assume that there's an assembly forge on Anvil Station. The Swords of Sanghelios were working with Oni and UNSC scientists to teach humans how to use assembly forges. The imperfection kind of reveals itself in the case of mutations, such as the Xanar pattern light cruiser. This very small cruiser is a mutation of the Ket and Elephant pattern battlecruisers, both much larger but nearly identical in shape. The mutation is defined as stable, meaning the ship can still be used effectively despite its small size. This is, in reality, 343 explaining the reason why so many Covenant ships of varying size look the same, going back all the way to Halo 3 and Reach. The Covenant is not as obsessed with categorization as humans are, and is nowhere near as rigorous in their uniformity as the UNSC. A human could look at dozens of different wraiths and view them all as different tanks. The Covenant simply does not care, as long as they work. And so there are thousands of patterns of vehicle, weapon, armor set, or ship class that go undesignated, whereas humans are very clear about what class of ship, type of vehicle, type of weapon they're creating. It's all very fluid in the Covenant, which fits their curvy biological motif for their ships and weaponry. The naming conventions for patterns are all derived from Sangheli words, that is to say Covenant Sangheli, which is really an amalgamation of Covenant, Ungoi, Kigyar, Sanshayum languages all becoming one that they still call Sangheli. After the war ended, as I talked about in the Hakarta pattern breakdown, the Sangheli rediscovered their old ships which could be manufactured without the primary assembly forges. They all have the drawbacks that we covered in that breakdown, but the point is I think they were getting across that those ships can be manufactured without the Covenant's assembly forges. The Covenant patterns that we know of in relation to their human designations are as follows. The Shawata pattern supercarrier is the CSO class supercarrier. The Ruma pattern light carrier is the DDS class carrier. The Carroll, Siphon, and an unidentified pattern of assault carrier are all designated as CAS class assault carriers. The Kewu pattern battleship has no human designation. The Razis pattern interdictor or battleship also has no human designation. The Varric pattern heavy cruiser is the ORS class heavy cruiser. The Ket pattern battlecruiser is the CCS class battlecruiser, the classic, the OG. The Elephant pattern battlecruiser has never been seen and has no human designation, only being name dropped in Halo Warfleet and Encyclopedia. The Maugan pattern armored cruiser is the RCS class battlecruiser. The Xanar pattern light cruiser is the CRS class light cruiser. The Sonaris pattern heavy executioner is the CPV class heavy destroyer. They use the word executioner rather than destroyer. The Esther pattern armored frigate is the CAR class frigate, the only Covenant frigate, one of my favorites. The Suitor pattern heavy corvette is the SDV class heavy corvette. The Makar pattern light corvette is the DAV class light corvette. The Rothan pattern fire ship has no human designation. The Covenant stealth ship has no canon name, as I doubt that is what it's actually called. The Mutan Et pattern storm cutter is the DAS class storm cutter. The Acton pattern escort is the ADP class escort. The Murn pattern agricultural support ship is the DSC class support ship. There are plenty of Covenant ships we never get to know either the human or Covenant designations for. They usually appear in books or comics and they're never mentioned again, but as we said, there are thousands of different patterns of these things and we just don't get to see the most of them. They apparently have at least one other pattern of super carrier and at least one other pattern of normal carrier or assault carrier. There's at least one other pattern of cruiser. There's one other pattern of destroyer, and considering that the Sonaris pattern is designated as a heavy destroyer, that's not to say that the other is a light one, but it's at least lighter than the Sonaris. There are other designations of frigates, at least one other pattern of corvette, and there are plenty of other ships that we have no idea what pattern or type they even were. The vestige ships that the elites have dug up since the end of the war don't have any human designations. The premier ship out of this lot is the Hekarta pattern blockade runner, the ship that is almost half the length of the Infinity and yet somehow still designated as a corvette. That's a fun ship. I did a breakdown on that one. Click up here in the top right to see that video. It's a good one. After you finish this one, of course. The Lursu pattern brigantine is a huge heavy carrier. The Ursakosh pattern man of war, now I've always thought of this as a small destroyer, but at 526 meters it could easily be a corvette. The Rawaru pattern Karak is described as a merchant cruiser, and the Usiumru pattern void piercer was built to be a multi-role ship. For smaller ships and weapons the same applies, but they use the term type instead of class in most cases. Many of the phantoms used by the Covenant and Jul 'Mdama's Covenant were called Ruswum pattern phantoms, but designated as Type 44 and Type 52 troop carriers by the UNSC. The Kez Katu pattern Phantom, also designated as Type 52 TC, was the most modernized Phantom they ever used. The Urshwupa pattern Phantom was a modified Phantom gunboat meant to take on fighters, no human designation. The Nurok Zur pattern warrior transport is known as the Type 57 troop carrier, and the Mikpramu pattern warrior transport is known as the Type 57 dropship troop carrier. The Dextro Zur pattern warrior transport was referred to as both the DX class dropship and the Type 25 troop carrier. The Mokolta pattern heavy spirit was simply referred to as a super spirit by Kelly 087. That's not official or anything. The Taku Zur pattern spirit was the Type 28 troop carrier. The Kamiro Sish pattern world patroller was the Type 56 deployment platform ground support super heavy, or Lich, bit of a mouthful that one. The Urea Kuk pattern command shuttle, no human name, was a transport for Covenant VIPs, like Sanchayum and Sangheili council members. The Seraph was the most common exo-atmospheric fighter in the Covenant, and it came in two flavors. The Kai pattern heavy strike fighter had no human designation, and the Morsum pattern heavy strike fighter was the Type 31 exo-atmospheric multi-role fighter. The Keljirik pattern heavy strike fighter was also known as the Tarask, unknown if this was a human designation. The Nueo pattern world striker was known to humanity as the Gigas fighter bomber. The Elseta pattern strike fighter was known as the Type 27 exo-atmospheric multi-role fighter. The Ogle pattern attack flyer is the Type 26A ground support aircraft. The Ispalax pattern attack flyer is the Type 26B ground support aircraft. The Draylak pattern and Taved pattern attack flyers, the customized Banshees of the Heretic faction from Halo 2, were the Type 26AZ ground support aircraft and Type 26BZ ground support aircraft respectively. The Erdnecht pattern attack flyer is the Type 26C ground support aircraft. The Denolme pattern attack flyer is the Type 54 ground support aircraft. The Bakoe pattern support fighter is the Type 29 close support fighter, or simply the vampire. The Sisho pattern ship breacher is the Type 28 intrusion vehicle, aka Tick. The Breezer pattern ship breacher is simply known as a leech. The Agoro workshop Tronto is known as such. The Suspa pattern individual assault carapace, or the Fire Seed, is a Sangheili drop pod. The Kaluke pattern breaching carapace is the Type 55 squad breaching carapace. The Kalute pattern breaching carapace is the Type 55 individual breaching carapace. The Glodo pattern breaching carapace is the Type 51 individual breaching carapace. The Glodo cast pattern assault carapace is the Type 53 mass deployment carapace. The Glodo Kef pattern assault carapace is the Type 53 squad breaching carapace. The Yado pattern intrusion carapace is known as such. The Yado Kef pattern assault carapace is known as such. And the Udka pattern assault carapace is known as such. The closest thing that the Covenant has to civilian vehicles would be the transports used by the Prophets on High Charity. The Granian was a particularly luxurious one, and it doesn't have any pattern designation or human designation. The Iknukek pattern, Maravalot's pattern, and Kallio pattern administrator were all different domestic transports. This weird indescript diplomatic shuttle is also a thing. The larger Banished ships are different in that they have no pattern or human designation, instead all having 1 or 2 word names. The ships all being a bit ramshackle would hinder them giving them rigid classifications in the first place. The Banished Dreadnought is simply the Banished Dreadnought, the Carve is the Carve, the Dracar is the Dracar. They do make use of the Kigyar intrusion corvettes, but like, look at this thing. Look at who made it. You think these guys are gonna have an in-depth naming system? No, they don't care. Their smaller ships do go by workshop that built them though, almost all being courtesy of the same group. Eklandal Workshop Phantoms are built from Ruswum pattern Phantoms. Eklandal Workshop Liches are made from Kamiro Sish pattern Liches. Eklandal pattern Spirits are made from Dextra Zur pattern Spirits. The Kalem Workshop Attack Flyer made from an Ispalax pattern Banshee. The Atulai Workshop Attack Flyer made from the Ogle pattern Banshee. A Banished specific one though is the Barug Kel Workshop Sky Raider, also known as the Trespasser, as well as the Klavbrig Workshop Deceiver, aka Shroud, the Gaidrazka Workshop Siege Crawler, aka Blisterback, and the Devota Workshop Lair Waster, Jesus that name, also known as the Griever Fighter Bomber, and the Berukaza Workshop Siege Hauler is known as such. Many of the vehicles and weapons also have a human and Covenant designation, but there are far too many to go over in this one video. I personally prefer the cool alien names of these ships, and it's easier for my brain to memorize them by pattern than designation, at least for the large warships, that is. I'm not going out there memorizing all the fucking phantoms and drop pods. There's a lot of interesting things to note in all this, like the fact that only spirits have the suffix Zur except for the leech, which looks a lot like a spirit with only 1 front prong, or that everything with the nanolaminate purple plating on it that's formed in the assembly forges has those little hexagons on there. It's pretty cool. It's a cool detail. But that's all for this one. I've got a few more videos on the docket, one of which is on a ship in the Halo universe that is not a military ship at all. Try and wrap your heads around that one. And another that may be the beginning of a new series on this channel. If those sound of interest to you, why not subscribe? I try my best to upload at least once a week. Between this channel and my general one, mark the crawler in the description. I probably used some Sins of the Prophets models in this, so check the description for a link to the mod in the game. It's really fun. You should give it a look. Anyway, that's all I've got. Peace.